Hello, and welcome to another Digital Photo Mentor live stream of photo editing. Today, I'd like to welcome the Charlotte Camera Club members who've submitted their images, which you'll see over here somewhere. I'm trying to point at my other screen, and whose images I'm going to be working on today in this live stream. If you're new to this channel and to this live stream, every Wednesday at this time, I take subscriber images from people who are following on YouTube or on the website digitalphotomentor.com, and I bring them into my editing workflow. So things that you're going to learn today will be how I approach an image, what I look for in terms of how to decide how to edit it, and how to determine then to how to apply those images and those edits best. The tools that I use in my workflow are Lightroom as my main photo editor, and I also use Photoshop sometimes when the need arises, and also Luminar AI. So I'll be using probably a combination of at least a couple of those today to edit these images. Please remember, if you enjoy today's live stream, please give it a thumbs up, like it, and subscribe to the channel. And you can also hit the notifications bell so that YouTube will let you know when I have a new video and when we have this live each week. So without further ado, let's get started. Okay, I'm back here in Lightroom. Let me get this guy off my screen here. So as I said, these images are in Lightroom, and you're going to see me looking over here because I'm working with two screens today. And hopefully our Charlotte Camera Club members are joining in. So if you've submitted images and you're new to watching YouTube Lives, there's a chat window over on the side, or if you enlarge the video, it might be down below. So if you have any questions or comments about what I'm doing live, please put it in the chat. You'll also notice my husband Rob will be in the chat as well, and he will be answering some questions as we go along and picking out questions if I miss anything. So again, let's get started. So I'm just going to say hi to a few of our regulars. Ron, we see you every week. Awesome. He's got his coffee. We're past coffee stage at this point, Ron. I've already done a 2-hour or 3-hour masterclass with Pete Vanderdine earlier today. So we're past the coffee stage. Catherine, we saw you earlier today. So wow, you're having as busy day as we are. Welcome. Linton, again from Adelaide, always good to see you. Deb, all of our regulars from Alaska, and Holly. So welcome back, everyone. If you're just tuning in, these are the images again from the Charlotte Camera Club. So I'd like to thank Lorraine and the organizers there for arranging this tutorial for you guys. So I'm going to just go through a few, or I'm going to get through as many of these as possible, but I'll make sure to do one from each person first that has done submissions. So let's just see. Okay, so Joan has submitted a couple of images, and I know she mentioned this one. Let me zoom out here. So I'm just going to go and look at your comments. So Joan said, about this one, that she feels that it's underexposed and should have used a slower shutter speed. How do I make up for this without looking over processed? I don't know about a slower shutter speed. Let's take a look at her settings here. One thing I will let you know about is that if you were watching the masterclass with Pete earlier today, you'll know that we were working with the new masking tools. I have upgraded my Lightroom, so I'm currently using the newest Lightroom Classic with the new masking tools. So when I go through this and I'm doing any type of masking, if yours looks different, you are probably using Lightroom 11 or older, so you'll be using the radial filter, the graduated filter, or the brush. Okay, so these will be similar but different, right? And if you have any questions about that as I go along, just pop them in the chat. Okay, so as far as slower shutter speed, I'm not sure, Joan, if you're actually attending live, I'm not sure why you'd want to use a slower shutter speed here. If you used a slower shutter speed, you might get the clouds moving and blurring, but otherwise there's really not a reason to use a slower or a longer shutter speed, right? In this case, She's mentioned that the image is a little bit underexposed, but it's not really. When you want to see if an image is properly exposed, you want to look at the histogram, which is up here in the top right hand corner, right? And it's within the boundaries of the histogram between white, which is on the right, and black, which is on the left, right? So it's within the realm of a normal exposure, okay? So there's nothing that's going off the back end or too dark. Could it have had a little more exposure? Yes, but it's not really all that bad. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you what I would do to correct the exposure as opposed to using the actual exposure slider, okay? Because the exposure slider actually affects the midtones of the image more so than the upper end of the graph, okay? So notice when I want you to look at the histogram up here, and I don't know if you can, maybe I can zoom in on my screen a little bit. Does that help? Can you see the histogram better now? When I zoom in on this, what happens is when I put my mouse on the slider for exposure, see how the middle part of the histogram is sort of grayed out, okay? What that means is I can do the same thing up here. So if I put my mouse on the middle of the histogram, and click and drag, like see how it gives me those arrows? So I'm clicking and holding and dragging up and down, and you'll see that it's the exposure slider that's actually moving, right? So what that means is the exposure slider really only affects the midtones, right? So in this image, I actually just want to stretch this over so that the whites touch the right-hand side. And there's a really fun and quick shortcut to do that. So if you hold the Shift key, double click on the word whites, so not on the slider, okay? Watch what happens, right? The histogram shifted over to the right, right? And now it's touching the right side of the graph, meaning that there is probably some pure white. Let me undo that, and I'm going to do it again. So watch the graph this time. Shift, double click the word whites, and that's what occurs. Right? Now, if I want to check to make sure that there's nothing clipping, so clipping means that it's going off the graph and no detail, I'm going to hold down the Alt Option key while I click the slider. Anything that you see that's white or color means that it's clipping. So if I see that, anything that I see there that's in white or in those green colors, that means that that area then is clipping with no detail, and it won't print with any detail if you print it, okay? So another way to get to the same point is to drag the slider up until you see some of these clipping warnings, and then bring it back to the left until there isn't any. And we kind of end up back where we started when I double clicked it, okay? I'm also going to do the same thing to the black slider or the blacks. And now notice it didn't move very much because it was pretty much already there anyways. And I'm going to do the same trick, hold Alt Option. And in this case, I want more black. Okay. So one of the things that Joan mentioned is that it was sort of flat looking and hazy. And by adding some blacks in, you'll actually get rid of a lot of that haze problem. Okay. So see how the more blacks I add, the less haze there is. So I'm going to make sure that I have some blacks clipping. Okay. You'll also notice that when I do that, okay, it changes the color saturation and increases the color saturation. Okay. Now that I've sort of corrected the exposure a little bit, we can start to play with each individual tone. We can also work with a camera profile. Okay. So camera profiles by Adobe, you can see them in here, okay, if you're using Lightroom. If you have some camera profiles preloaded, now notice that my Lightroom recognizes that this camera profile is from an Olympus, right? So it's showing me the various different camera profiles available for Olympus, including vivid, portrait, muted, and neutral, okay? So we could go with muted. Looks like it picks up a bit more sky. Portrait generally gives you more red. I'm going to go with the neutral, okay? There's also more artistic ones which come with Lightroom, and you can also purchase profiles, creative profiles. Pete, that did our webinar earlier today, has lots of those. Okay, now this one actually improves the green, so I might even go with that one. But I'm just going to go with neutral. And next thing I'm going to do is correct the white balance. Okay, the image itself looks a little bit too much blue. So we can do that a few ways. We can pull down this little menu here. Now, because she shot a raw file, you'll notice that all of the camera white balance presets are still there. So I could choose any one of those. So I'm going to do a couple of things. I'm just going to choose auto first to see what Lightroom picks. Okay, so that's not bad. It's definitely better and less blue. I'm going to choose shade, right? That's pretty similar. I find that usually when I'm choosing shade or cloudy, I like them, but I minus some of the magenta, right? And we're getting pretty close now to something that looks a little greener, especially in this valley, right? So the next thing I'm going to do is I increase the exposure. I'm actually going to put it back. So I just did that by double clicking. And we're going to bring the highlights down. Okay, so watch what happens when I adjust the highlights. Okay, so the highlights are affecting the tones that are not quite pure white, right? Okay, now if I do something to adjust the exposure back darker again, that does nice things on the top half of the image, but not the bottom half of the image, okay? So everything I'm doing here is what's called a global edit. It applies to the entire image. In this case, I only want to affect the top half of the image, so I'm going to do what's called a gradient or linear gradient filter, okay? So if you're using the older version of Lightroom, it's a graduated filter. Okay, now they're calling it a linear gradient. We can also increase the clarity. And on landscape images, clarity works really well, and you can take it fairly high without going sort of over the top. With people images, I generally don't go over about 20. And as a general rule of thumb, I almost never put clarity up over 50 on the entire image. Okay, if I want to bring emphasis to one part of the image, I will use it as a local adjustment, and I'll show you that in a moment. Welcome, Clark. Thanks for joining, and I've got one of your images as well that I'll be working on today. And Stephanie's here as well from Oregon. Welcome, everybody. Another slider that I use often is dehaze. And with this one, oops, got my mouse on the wrong screen. With the, oops, let me go back here. So clarity, I'm going to leave it at about 25 or so, 30. Dehaze, what it helps to do is that haze that's in the background, okay, if I increase it, you see what it's doing. It's very similar to what happened when I pulled down the black slider, and you can see the opposite is true. If I go the other way, it looks like it's a whiteout. Okay, so I'm going to pull dehaze up a little bit, but again, you can start to see that it's affecting the foreground almost too much. Okay, so I'm going to scale my black slider back a little bit. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to apply a local adjustment tool. Okay, so a local adjustment tool is anything that applies to only part of the image. For those of you that are watching live, please tell me in the chat if you are using Lightroom, and I know that some of you from the Camera Club said that you were, have you upgraded to this new version with this selective masking and these new masking tools? I'd love to know if you're using these and what you're having trouble with, because we literally just did a 6-hour masterclass on this, and it will be available if you weren't on the calls live, on the video classes live. Okay, so I'm going to apply a linear gradient. Right, now, if you are using an older version of Lightroom, you'll recognize this little crosshairs X thing. Okay. And what that means is when I click and drag, it's going to, I'm just going to apply a -4 exposure. So when I click and drag, okay, it's applying -4 exposure from the edge of the image into where I've clicked to pull it down. Okay. And when I spread the lines further apart, there's more of a fade. Okay. It's more gradual. When I bring them closer together, you can see that it's more of a hard line. Right? So I'm going to spread that out. And I obviously don't want it quite so dark, right? And I actually don't want it dark at all. You'll see what I'm going to do in a minute. But I'm just getting it placed for now. So I want it to sort of start there and fade out as we get to the bottom of the image. Okay, so I'm doing my placement. Okay, the red overlay that you see at the top can be turned off and on with the new tool. Okay, you can also change its color. Okay, so now that I've got it where I want it, I did a little bit of minus exposure, but I'm going to do that dehaze. So it's only working on the top of the image. Okay, now I can see that I want to pull it down a little farther. Okay, and let's not go quite so far with the dehaze, and maybe back up with the exposure. Okay, so what this is doing is making the top half of the image look more like the bottom. Okay, now I'm also adding blacks. Okay, and I'm going to add some more yellow because the top half to me still looks more yellow, and might even add a little bit of magenta. Okay, like so. So now we're getting closer. Now, if I turn this off, turn off the mask, you can see what that graduated filter is doing. Okay, if you're using the new version, you can rename your mask. So I'm just going to put sky gradient. That's what I'm going to call this one. Right. I can also add to or subtract to this one with these new tools. But for the purposes of this image, I think that's all I need to do here because it's evened it out a lot better. So I can do any of these things in here. I can add contrast. Okay, you can see what that's doing. Oops, I have to actually select it. That works better. So I can add contrast. Okay, actually that does a nice job as well. Okay, I can add shadows. Okay, now shadows, if I go to the right, removes the shadows, but to the left, have you ever gone to the left with your shadows? Okay, so you can actually increase the contrast that way as well. Okay, so I'm just gonna play with these sliders and dance around a little bit, and then when I'm ready, just close my filter. Okay, so let's take a look at the before and after. I'm just pressing the backslash key on the keyboard to see the before and after. Okay, so I've brightened the whole thing up a little bit, and look at the histogram now. It's much more evenly spread out. And now I can go and revisit my Alt Option key and check for clipping. See, now that I've increased the darkness of the sky, I can actually take the whites a little bit farther, okay, which will give it a little more contrast yet again. I can check my blacks, make sure that I have a little bit of blacks clipping, and that looks pretty good. Something else that I might want to do with this image is see if it's straight, because I'm not sure if the horizon is straight. There's a few ways that you can do that. You can use the crop tool, okay? There's an auto button inside the crop tool, and you can see that if I press it, it did tilt it a little bit. If I'm happy with that, I can just close it. If not, I can just grab the corner here, and you see that when my mouse moves up to the corner or near the corner, it changes to a little thing that looks like two arrows on either side. Okay, so if my mouse is here, that's resizing that way. But if I move it, you'll see it changes. See the icon change? Right? Now I can rotate and figure out if it's straight. And when I'm clicking and holding, it gives me this grid. So it gives me a better idea of things that are perfectly horizontal and vertical. The trick with this image is there isn't really a clear or straight horizon. It's hard to tell from the mountains. We don't have any buildings, so tricky to tell if it's straight. So really it's just subjective in this case, right? The other way that you can do it is, sorry, let me go back to the crop tool, using this little ruler. Okay, so where it says angle, if I click on the ruler, it's like it comes off. Okay, then what I can do with that ruler is, let's just say I'm going to assume that sort of the top of these mountains are straight. So I can draw a line from one to the other, and when I let go, it straightens the horizon based on that line that I drew. Okay, so it makes sure that that line is straight. Right? The other way that you can do straighten is to use the transform tools in Lightroom. Okay, if you're using Luminar, you're going to use the crop tool, and you can tilt and re-rotate that way. And this one you want to use level. So if I click level, you can see that the program thinks level is back the other way. Okay, So somewhere in the middle, okay, it's actually straightened it back again. Right, let's try level and see if it does it again. So a little bit. This one works better if you have buildings. So I'll see if there's another image that has buildings. The other thing that I might consider with this one is actually cropping it, okay? Because what do you want to think about with your images now that we've done sort of the tone control, the color control, is where do we want the viewer to actually look? What is the subject? Okay, so for me, the subject or the most interesting part is the middle of this valley, excuse me, where these clouds are sort of hovering down here in the valley. Okay. So once we know that, then let's think about, okay, is there anything in this image that's extraneous or doesn't need to be there to add to that story? This bush in the foreground, I'm not crazy about it. It doesn't really add anything. It just makes it feels like the valley is blocked. So I'm actually going to come up to about there. And I'm going specifically there because I'll show you in a minute. Okay. I'm going to go there. And I'm going to come in a little bit on this side just to get rid of that red barn. Let's see, and get this little cloud sort of off center in the thirds. And let's see what that looks like. Okay. Now, the reason I stopped the cropping here is I wanted to show you what I try to avoid. So what I try to avoid are bright areas on the edge of the image, okay? So when I did the crop, I might come up higher to there or in that middle bit so that the dark trees are at the bottom edge, okay? I'm also going to apply an edge vignette, and that's under the effects tool. And my trick for that is drag it real dark, okay? And this works for any tool. What I suggest is like whenever you're doing a local adjustment or you're doing pulling a slider, take things to extreme because then you can really see what it's doing and apply the effect and then take it back to somewhere in the middle. And I'll show you sort of what it looks like when it's over edited versus what you should be going for. Okay, so this is obviously too overdone. It's too dark, and I've turned the feather all the way down to 0. So you've got a hard edge on the vignette. And I do that so that I can place the size and the roundness. Okay, so let's say I want it a little bit more round, which we could do, and a little smaller. Okay, so now I've got the size and the shape that I want. Okay, then I turn the feather back up to something over 50, and then I will adjust the amount so that I don't have something that looks like that. Okay, so you want to soften your edges. I'm also going to bring this highlight slider up because you'll see what happens is it anything that's darker on the edges of the image, okay, like see over here in between these clouds, when I bring this highlight slider up, it applies less to those bright areas. Okay? We can also try a different mode, color mode. Color priority mode I find is a little softer on images like this. Okay? And I almost never use the paint overlay because it just looks like gray. Okay, so I usually use highlight priority or color priority on my vignette. Okay, the higher you go with the feather, the softer the edge. Okay, you want to avoid doing vignettes that look like that. Right. The idea with your editing is that you want to look at the image and go, wow, that's a really cool, excellent image, not, oh, really cool editing. Okay. Let's see where everybody's at in the chat over here. So Deb's upgraded. Clark is upgraded. Linton is upgraded. So is Barbara, Susan. Awesome. Okay. Ron is still using Lightroom 6. Yes. So a good option for you, actually, Ron. And I'm trying to get my hands on a technical early version of Luminar Neo. I would say that's going to be a good option for you as a plugin, and then you don't have to upgrade to the newest Lightroom if you don't want to pay the subscription. The next thing I want to finalize with this image, and then we'll move on to another one, and we're going to go a little faster on the next one. So you've got kind of the basic techniques, is where my eye goes is this little white building right here, and I want to take my eye away from that. So I'm actually going to use the cloning tool, believe it or not. Okay, so this seems counterintuitive, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to just draw over it. Okay, the Lightroom cloning tool has limitations, and you can see that I can get rid of the building completely. But if I bring the opacity down to about 30 or so, right? What it does is it just tones that building down, right? See how I can just turn it on, off and on. Let's go about 50% actually, because it's pulling from this dark area over here of the forest, and it's creating this sort of cover to the building. Okay, see that? So I didn't want to get rid of it completely. And if I wanted to, I could do the same thing with these guys over here. Okay? And you'll notice that it remembers the settings that I just used, and it applies the same settings. Okay? And that's about all I would do for this image. Okay? So let's take a look at a before. Okay, so very hazy, very flat, lots more punch, right? Let's go back to, okay, now I know Clark is here, and I'm hoping that everybody else is watching us here. Okay, so Clark's got a couple of images. Which one would you prefer I do first? This one, we just did a landscape, so let's do one that's a little bit different. So it looks like a silhouette. I'm going to go back up to the basics here. Now, this one is opposite of the other one. So what we can tell from this one is that there's no black because the histogram is blank on the left. So there's no pure black. There's lots of white and light tones and not very much in the middle. So it's very high contrast, right? Which is what you get with a silhouette when the light is behind like this, right? So if I press J on my keyboard, it shows me what's clipping in the image, okay? You can also do that with this little triangle up here by clicking it. So you can see that all the highlights on the water are extra white, super white, okay? So I'm actually going to bring the exposure down, okay? And if I want to bring or try and get some detail on the highlights, I'm holding that Alt Option key again while I'm clicking highlights. You can see that if I keep going till I get to about minus 55, okay, now we have highlights with detail. Okay, so that's going to give me a little more detail in the background. And if I want pure black, same idea with the blacks, keep going until I get some black. Okay, so there's a couple of different ways to go with this image. Okay, we could try and get some detail out of the subject so we can see them a little better, or we could go with a full silhouette. I'm going to give them a little bit of clarity. Okay, might even do a little bit of dehaze. Let's see what that does. Okay, so if I want to go with a full silhouette, right, using dehaze helps to do that. Okay, adding a vignette's going to help as well. So I'm going to add one that's fairly strong, and let's get it in there. Now, the one problem with the vignette and the post-crop vignette in Lightroom is that you can't off-center it, okay? If you're using Luminar, you have the ability to place it, okay? So I'm going to make this one a little softer and not so dark, and I'm going to use a radial filter instead, okay? So add a mask, and I'm going to use a radial gradient, right? Or a better way actually to do this would be to select subject, but I'm going to do this for now to show you. Okay, let's change my feather a little bit. Okay, so I'm basically pulling this around the subject. Okay, but I want to invert it. Okay, so there's an invert button up here. So now it's opposite. It's on the outside around them. Okay, and I want to darken. So just like I would in a vignette, I want to darken the outside. Okay. We could also try bringing down the contrast, try bringing down the clarity and the texture, right? Because what's happening is when we get these highlights, we can almost turn this into like bokeh, right? Look what happens when I bring down the texture and the clarity. I can even bring down the sharpness. Okay, we've actually created these bokehs now, right? So let's see what that's doing. Can you see the difference? Right? Now, the mask is not perfect because, oops, let's just get on the mask again. Okay, so the mask is not perfect because I used a radial filter. Okay, if we want a better way to do that, and you'd have to do it this way if you're using an older version of Lightroom like Ron. So I'm actually going to just turn this one off for a moment. Okay, and I'm going to create a new mask and hit select subject. So this is the part that's really exciting in Lightroom now is now, look, it has selected the subject Oops, it looks like it missed a little bit, so we're gonna have to fix that. Okay, so for those of you that were watching earlier today on the Lightroom Masterclass, you might have some ideas on how to do that. So I'm going to add to this selection because I want to pick up the boat. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so I can see it a little better. So I'm going to add the luminance range, okay, because the boat is the darkest thing. And I'm just going to drag over here, right? So now you can see it picked up most of the boat, okay, but it's also picked up the same things inside the water, okay? So what I should have done is I'm going to delete this, okay? So it didn't work the way I had planned. So I'm going to try it again. I'm going to select luminance range first. So I'm going to select everything in this darkness range. Okay, now you can see that it did select the highlights in the water or the shadows in the water as well as the subject. Okay, and we can adjust the blend mode of how much darks and lights are affected with this slider over here. Okay, so keep it about there. But if we use the new intersect, which we learned in our webinar, okay, so I'm holding Alt Option to get this intersect button. Okay, so intersect means that it's going to give me a part of the current selection and something else. Okay, so I'm giving it two criteria. I'm saying it must match this luminance or brightness range of the shadows, and it must be within the subject. So I'm going to say select subject. So what it should do is give me just those dark tones inside the subject. Okay, now we're back to the same problem. It still hasn't selected the boat. All right, let's see if I can now add this luminous range. It's still giving me that. Aha, okay, let's try something different. Let's try adding a radial gradient. So if I add this radial filter here, same subject, same problem. Interesting. So this is a tricky one because it's not selecting that boat. We learned about how much Pete, hates masking using the brush. So I'm going to delete this one, but I'm going to use a brush. So I'm going to add with the brush, and I'm going to use auto mask, flow up higher, and I'm just going to turn off my little mouse thing for a second here. Okay, so when I paint, I can see where I'm painting. Okay, so I've turned on auto mask, so then Lightroom's going to try and find the edges of this boat for me. There we go. Okay, so now we have a good selection. Now I can come back to do what I want to do with this mask. So I would like to darken. Okay, if we want to make it a pure silhouette, we can make her black. Okay. Now the trick is if we want to invert this, we have to invert all the components inside here. Okay, so that's the tricky part. Let me invert. There we go. Now let's see what we got. So now we've got the subject selected, and I want the opposite. Okay, apparently I'm going to have to practice on this one a little bit because I'm not getting it either. I might have to resort to asking Pete myself because this one is not working as I intended. So, no, he does not like the brush. He was not kidding about that. So I'm not working so well on this one. So let's come back to this guy a little bit more. Okay, so as I said, we have the option of doing a silhouette like this, or we could go the opposite way and have some more detail in the subject. Okay, so since I've got the subject already selected here, since I've got the subject already selected, or I did have, I'm going to delete this one and start over. I've made a mess. See, I can make a mess too. Select subject. All right. I'm going to increase the exposure. Now you can see where it's applying, right? So we can bring some detail But often what I'll do, instead of doing exposure, I will actually bring up whites and exposure and shadows. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit of detail on our surfers. Okay, and if I want to just paint in that boat again, I'll just paint in the boat. There we go. Now we got it. All right. So that gives me a better sort of detail in our boaters, right? So then if I'm going to go that way, I might overexpose the background, okay? So you have a couple of ways to approach an image like this, right? This one is really super contrasty, so we can actually work with that and create more bokeh and more contrast, or we can cut it down, right? I actually kind of like the really over bright highlights myself. So I might actually leave it like that. So I prefer the silhouette. The other thing I might do is crop this image because they've got sort of equal distance between the back end of the boat and the front end. And when you have somebody that's moving or facing a certain direction, you want to generally leave distance in front of them, okay? I'm also going to take some off the top, still leaving them sort of in that third position. And I'm moving it up so I can get rid of that highlight at the bottom again, okay? Always watch the edges of your image, okay? So edges will be where you're going to find garbage cans, a cigarette butt, things like that, power poles, okay? One other thing that I'm going to do with this one is flip it, okay? So under photo, flip horizontal, okay? Now the reason that I did that, and I'm just going to make a virtual copy and then undo this one step here. Undo one step. Oh, no, won't undo that apparently. Okay. I want to show you the difference. So when the subject is looking to the left, okay, we read left to right, top to bottom, right, in our language, in our society. And when they're looking to the left, it feels like they're looking backwards, okay? Now look at the difference when I do it this way, okay? Can you see the difference? How does that feel different than that one? And on an image like this, you can do these kinds of things because it really doesn't matter. You're the only one that knows which way it was photographed, right? Okay. Hi, Lorraine. Nice to have you join us. She's not using Lightroom. So tell me what you are using, Lorraine, because you didn't send any images, so I'm not sure what you are using. I know that Linda said she was using Luminar, and Joan said she's using Topaz Studio, which I don't have. So, and Don said he was using Photoshop. Okay, so I do have that. So I'd love to know what you are using, Lorraine, or anybody else watching, if you're using something different. Okay, so that's what I would do with that one, Clark. Let's pick something different. And I'm going to go, was it Linda that I said was using Luminar? Linda Springer. We got two Lindas. Linda Harris. Okay. Excuse me. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm just going to take myself off here so we can go full screen. Okay, Linda Springer has sent two images. And let's see what she said. I want to know how to give them punch without making them look unrealistic. That is generally my goal as well. So she's got a couple of landscapes here. This one has got some really interesting foreground and depth to it. So I'm probably going to work on this one, but I want to talk about this one a little bit because the sky is really blown out, and I'm going to show you how to change that using Luminar AI. We can do a sky replacement without making it look overdone, right? This one here, she's using Lightroom, so I'm going to work on that. Thank you. Apologies, I am just going to have a cough drop. So if you hear me, that's what I've got in my mouth. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm looking at the exposure. Everything looks really good. There's lots of depth. And I'm going to go to these camera profiles again. Okay. So she has used a Sony camera, and you can see that it's also pulled the Sony profiles here. So let's just mouse over these. So clear, deep, light, landscape. You can see that the color is punchier there. Neutral, portrait. Portrait actually brings out a lot of detail. Vivid. I almost never use the vivid camera profiles because once I add the blacks, like I showed you, it will go overboard. Okay. I might actually start with neutral here again. Clear is nice too, but it's got lots of lost detail in this blacks. Okay. So I'm going to start with neutral because we're going to be punching up the contrast even more, and I want to keep as much as possible from the beginning. Okay. So I'm going to do my little trick again. Shift, double click on the whites, and then Alt Option just to check it. Okay. Shift, double click on the blacks. I'm going to add a little bit of clarity. Now, the reason that I don't add clarity overall is because it's going to add a lot of clarity into the sky, which tends to introduce noise as well. So I'm only going to add a bit and a bit of texture. Okay. And then I can selectively add texture to things that I want to add texture to individually. The shadows are quite dark, so I'm going to increase the shadows. So see, as I go real far to the right, I'm really lifting the shadows, right? So the thing that she mentioned is what she does not want to do. I'm going to show you overboard, okay? So overboard is going to extremes like this. And let's just say, okay, we want to do some contrast, and then maybe we want to do that. Okay, so that's extreme. And let's just say we're going to do a bad vignette as well. Something like that. Okay, so that's what you want to avoid. So what's happening here is we've got an obvious vignette. There's over retouching because we've got, look at what's happening on the sky. Right? So things you want to look for, let me turn my little mouse highlight on again, or can you see this halo that's happening, especially around the trees here? I'll zoom in even more. Right? Can you see there's like the sky's been darkened, but it didn't get those little bits inside of the tree, right? So when you take an image too far, you start to see these halos, or you'll start to see artifacts or something called banding. Okay. Banding means that when you have something like the sky that's a smooth color, it'll actually look like it's got stripes or pixelated. Okay. That's banding or artifacting. When you get those kinds of things, it means you've gone too far. Okay. So what you really want to do is scale it back. Okay, so first of all, we'll just fix our vignette, and we don't want to go too far. Okay. Oh, the other thing that goes too far is when you're doing overly saturated. Okay. So that's another reason why I said not to pick the vibrant camera profile, because it's going to take that to extremes. Okay. So this is also over edited in my opinion. Okay. The colors are really garish, and my personal, okay, where's my weekly followers? Tell me what I call this. You will get bonus points if you know what I call this. Okay, it's something you do not want to do. Okay. All right, so we don't want saturation and vibrance, and I'm just double clicking on any of the things I want to reset. So double click on a slider will reset it. Okay. So I don't want to go so extreme, right? Especially all over the entire image. All right. All right. That's much, much better. Okay. So now I want to do some local adjustments. And this is where the new masking tools are amazing. So I'm going to go select sky, and it's going to select just the sky for me. and it does a really good job. You can see it's got the red overlay. And once the sky's selected, I can just start adjusting my highlights. I can give it some clarity. I can give it some dehaze. That does a nice job, right? And let's see, maybe we even want to do a little bit less saturation, okay? The other way you could go with sky is I chose to add clarity and texture. We can actually go the other way, and you could make the sky look softer, okay? So you could make the clouds look dreamier if you want more focus on the landscape, which I think in this case we do, okay? So that looks pretty good. I'm going to bring the exposure down a bit. Notice that when I took the highlights down, it's not affecting the area closest to the horizon. So I'm going to take exposure down a little bit as well. Okay, and I'm going to show you one other trick that you can do without masking to fix this little area in here as well. Okay, so that's doing a really nice job. If I turn that on and off, okay. The next thing I'm going to do is see what it does when I select subject. Okay, we were playing with this earlier today in the masterclass. Okay, so it's selected the rocks. Oh, it's not bad. I'm going to say that we want a bit more of the foreground. Okay, but keep that in mind. Okay, because we might use that for something different. So I'm going to undo that. And instead of that, I'm going to do a linear gradient on the foreground. So I want to increase the texture on these rocks. Okay. Now, if I just want the rocks, I have a couple of options. Now I'm practicing what we learned today from Pete. Okay, is I'm going to intersect this one with a color range because I want just the colors from the rocks. Okay. And there we go. So now I've done a pretty good job of eliminating a lot of the water, and I can play around with the refinement here. So let's do about like that. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now I can say, okay, I want lots more texture in the rocks. So look at the difference. Lots of texture, and it's only applying to the rocks. Yay, I did it right this time. I give myself a gold star from Pete's class today. A lot of what like Catherine was in the class today, a lot of what you guys were learning, I was learning for the first time as well. Okay, I'm going to do one more gradient mask, or linear gradient, they're calling it now, because I want to darken this rock in the foreground. Okay, so I'm going to bring this up from the bottom, right? Keep the fade wide, and I'm going to darken. But you'll notice, once again, it's darkening the water. So I don't necessarily want to darken the water. Okay, so I can intersect, luminance range, and when I draw across, okay, it's only giving me that rocks again, but I can limit it by dragging these refinement sliders. Okay, so now let's see how we're doing. So now the rocks are being darkened, like so. Let's spread that out a bit more. There we go. Okay, so that looks pretty good. Let's do a before and after. Okay. A lot of what I do with editing is about tone control and where the viewer's eye is going. Okay, when we look at this image and I do a little trick, oh, who got the name of what I call that? Did anybody know what I call it? Overly saturated images? Nobody got it. Rob knows. Tell him, Rob. Right, when we look at this image upside down, what happens is your eyes will go to the part of the image that will naturally take your attention. Okay, so where do your eyes go here? And I'll use this as a trick because this is actually something that I used to do when I did retouching by hand with a little brush and dyes on prints. Stephanie's on the right track. Oh, Rob put it, yes. So I call it neon puke. So when you are looking at your image right side up, you know what you are photographing, but other people don't, right? So when you look at it upside down, it's actually a trick of the mind. You're tricking your eyes and your mind, because now your eyes go, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to look at here. Okay. So you'll go to the places that are taking attraction. Okay. There's 4 things that will grab your attention. Okay. And I'm going to put that up on the screen. I have this one ready because people always ask me this one, right? So those are the things that will grab your attention. The areas of brightness, lots of intense color, especially sharpness and contrast. So for this image, it's this little bit of this land right here, this little sandbar that's grabbing my attention. I'm seeing the clouds, so we could probably darken a little more there. And then the rocks, okay? And the rocks is where I want the eye to go, in the middle of this image. Now that I'm looking at this image upside down, it's making me think of something else. Okay, let's look at it right side up, right? Looks like a butt, doesn't it? Looks like somebody's butt. All right. So now once we're looking at the image right side up, I can say, okay, how can I fix that? So again, with the new masking tools, I can add another one, and I can do a radial gradient. So I'm going to do a radial gradient and just stretch it out over that little bit of land, right? Now, I don't think in this case I'm going to have to intersect or do anything, because I'm literally just going to bring the highlights down. So it should only apply to the brightest areas. So see how that's working? But if I wanted to limit it to not affect the water and so on, I could do another intersect and just pick that tonal range or this color, right? Like, for example, if I darken it lots more, right, then I'm going to intersect and say, okay, it needs to be this luminance range, but I got to zoom in here. Okay, now it's only on that little strip, okay, and I can affect which parts, okay, by adjusting these particular sliders. So you've got lots of control on how these things apply. And I wanted to show you how to affect that area of the sky a little bit further as well. Something else that I use a lot is the HSL tool, right? And that stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And lightness is luminance, okay? So I'm going to click on this little tool here. It's a little circle, and you see if I hover over it, it says adjust luminance by dragging in the photo. So this is what's called a targeted adjustment tool. So when I click on it, can you see it gives me this little X thing and then a circle with an arrow up and down, okay? So when I click, or wherever I click and hold down and then drag up or down, okay, like the arrow says, it's going to adjust the luminance or brightness of everything that's that tone. So watch what happens when I do it here. Okay, so dragging down, see how it pulled the blue and aqua sliders, or up, okay? So down, up. So I like what it's doing down, okay? But now look what's happened, okay? It's oversaturated and the color's a little bit off. So I'm still got my tool highlighted. Now I'm gonna lower that saturation again, right? So that looks a little better. You can also shift colors this way, right? So I could shift it more purple or more towards the cyan range. But in this case, I want to go a little more purple, right? Just hit escape. So now you can see that what the luminance sliders are doing, it's also affecting the water, okay? Because these are global edits, okay? So if you don't want the water affected, you have to apply that with one of the masking tools, okay? And unfortunately, in here, for example, they don't have HSL. I wish they did. Okay, if you're using Luminar, there's actually a tool for that, and I'll show that on the next image. So I'm going to scale it back just a tiny bit, like that. Right? We could also do the same thing on the rocks if we want to bring the brightness down on the rocks. And you can see that they are mostly yellow and orange. So if you're not sure what color something is, but you'll notice that it applies all over the entire image, okay? So that's the disadvantage of HSL, is that it does apply to the entire image, okay? But look at the difference that it's making, right? Just bringing those highlights down a bit more, okay? How are we doing? The only other thing I might do with this one, let's check to see if our horizon is straight. Okay, so we could try auto. Looks pretty straight. We could try the angle, and I'm just going to go sort of from the base of these trees to the base of the lake over there. Yeah, it looks pretty straight. Right? I'm going to crop a little bit from the left because I feel like there's sort of not as much interesting stuff there. And I want to get these mountains or bumps from the middle, okay? And I want to have sort of this rock be at the edge of the image. So it leaves us in the image here. And I'm watching what's happening on the edge with this tree here, okay? So I'm either going to come to the middle of the tree or make sure that I have the whole tree. So let's try the whole tree. I might even come up a little bit from the bottom just to get less of that rock that's out of focus, okay? So let's see a before and an after, okay? Catherine, no, you can't use HSL in a sky mask, and that's the part that's really disappointing. None of the tools in Lightroom have HSL as part of the mask. So there's my sky mask, right? So I can change the hue of the thing, but there's no HSL. I can't say I want to darken blues, right? It's not available as a local adjustment. So if you want to do that and you're using Lightroom, you have to either go to Luminar or go to Photoshop, actually. Actually, let me show you that in Luminar because I actually use Luminar quite a lot. Actually, I'm just going to reset this one. I use Luminar quite a lot as a plugin, right? So when I take it to Luminar, I'm usually doing sort of finishing things, but it does a great job, right? Like I'd say if I want to increase my greens. No. Oops, that's saturation. It does a really great job of doing things with sky as well because it's got a sky enhance automated feature. And I like what it did with these rocks. So to open it in Luminar, I'm right clicking and I'm choosing Luminar AI as my plugin. Right? I'm going to open it as a TIFF. Now, if you're working in Luminar directly, you would just go to the edit module. Okay. So I'm going to see a tab that says apply. You would see one for exporting. Okay. Susan says there are little yellow colors in the trees on the right that can be brought out. Yes, I could do that with the HSL sliders as well. I could increase the yellow luminance for sure. All right, let's see where I'm at with Luminar. It's probably opening on my other screen. Yes, it is. Give me a second to drag it over here. So I work with a laptop and a 27-inch monitor. All right, so in this one, I'm not going to use any of the templates because I know what I want to do here. I'm going to try the sky enhancer, and you can see basically all of the things that I was doing in Lightroom using the mask, it does with one slider. Okay, it also does a really great job with Accent AI, right, which sort of brightens shadows, checks for contrast, and things like that. Now I'm going to leave this guy a little bit lower, okay, because I'm going to show you how you can do the colors that we just did in Lightroom. So if you open the color tool, here is your HSL below on the advanced options, okay? Make sure you're on luminance, okay? Now there's no targeted adjustment tool here, but we just did that. We know that it's blue, okay? You can see that. Now look, it's affecting the water, and I'm going to show you how brilliant this is, right? I'm going to go blue and cyan. Let's see, there's a little bit of cyan in the sky, right? And let's say, okay, let's say we want a little bit less yellow. Yeah, it's not affecting the rocks as much, but we did want to spruce up the yellow in those trees, right? So let's go a little more yellow and green. There's also another tool for doing that. Okay, so let's take a look at what that's doing. If I just toggle that off, it's doing a good job on the sky, but we don't want it on the water. Okay, so each of the tools inside of Luminar comes with a mask. So I can do a gradient mask and say, oops, I think I put it upside down. You can say, I just want it up there, right? And now you can see that it's not affecting the water. It's just affecting the top half of the image, right? The other cool thing about it is that I can actually copy this mask, okay, and apply it on another tool and even invert it. Okay, so if I wanted more structure or more contrast and detail in the foreground, okay, so I'm just going to go to extreme so you can see what it's doing. Okay, so it's kind of like clarity, but if I only want that on the foreground, I can paste the mask. So now it's going to go on the sky and then invert it. Okay, now it's on the foreground. Right? And if I don't want it on all of those places, I can continue to mask it just like in Lightroom. Okay? I can also adjust it. Okay? But once you are finished in the Luminar and you're done with all the tools, you hit apply, it will make a new image and take you back to Lightroom. Another tool that I use a lot, and maybe my Luminar users can tell me if they use this one, okay, is this super contrast tool. So with super contrast, if I drag the highlight slider, look what happens to the sky and the clouds and the rocks. Okay, you can increase the highlights going to the left. It's kind of opposite of the sliders in the basic panel. So I can look what a great job I can do on the sky using these sliders. Okay, so that's really cutting down the highlights and keeping the contrast of the whole image with lots more detail. Right, I find the mid-tone contrast gives me a nice sort of punch in the middle. Right, let's go a little bit less on that. Okay, so here's a before and after from Luminar. And another one I use a lot in Luminar as a finishing tool is Mystical, and it'll give the image, I'll go to extremes, this sort of really neat glowy effect, right? It's kind of softens everything. For me, it works really well with landscapes. If I don't want it on the rocks, I could mask the rocks out and so on, right? I'm not going to do that just for essence of time. You can see before and after, and then I can go back to Lightroom. Does that answer your question, Susan, about adding some of the yellow to the trees? Because I did bring those trees out a little bit more as well. How's everybody doing? Any other questions? If you have any questions about what I'm doing as I'm working, please ask. Don't be afraid to ask. So let's take a look at the difference. So let's see. That's the Lightroom version. And that's the Luminar edit. Okay. So I use that a lot for sort of finishing my images. All right, let's pick someone I haven't done yet. No, Donald, what did you say? You're using Luminar as well. Okay, so we'll do one of Donald's. Now he sent a couple. I like this dragon, which is kind of cool. We could really work on that. Get rid of that. And this was kind of interesting in terms of it could be a really interesting abstract almost. But let's work on this dragon. A couple of things that strike me. So the first thing I want to look at is, okay, what do I want to do here? How's the exposure? How's the white balance? For the most part, the exposure is good. It looks good. If I hit J, you can see there's a little bit of whites clipping, okay? And that's easily fixed. And the first thing I'm going to do is choose the camera profile. But I'm also looking at, I don't like this tent over here. So I'm either going to copy it out, clone it out, or I'm going to just crop it out. Same thing with this sidewalk down here, right? Because it's really doesn't add anything. So either I'm going to crop real close, which might be the easiest solution in this case. Okay, so I'm going to choose a camera profile, and he's using a Canon 70D. Right, so now it's giving me Canon profiles. Okay, so you can see as I hover over these, they look really different. Okay, so look at the difference between portrait, the pink jumped out, versus landscape. The colors are intense there. Okay, so standard versus landscape. I think landscape looks pretty good, actually. Look at the colors, right? So we're going to go with landscape. Now we can fix our highlight problem. So I'm Alt Option, holding down Alt Option while clicking the highlight slider. Just go enough to the left till you don't see clipping anymore. Okay, so now we don't have any clipping on the whites, right? Let's see where we are with blacks. Now there's no clipping on the blacks, but there's a lot of black in these trees that are really dark. Now I don't necessarily want to bring out the detail, okay? So that's something else to consider is, yes, I could bring out all that detail, but then where does your eye go, right? If I leave this dark, oops, let me just double click that. Where does your eye go now? Okay, so remember I talked about your eye goes to sharpness, brightness, contrast, and color, right? Because the dragon is so bright and contrasty against those dark leaves, it stands out more when the trees have less detail, right? So don't worry about having detail everywhere in your image. Just have it on the subject and the thing that's important, right? All right, let's deal with the cropping. So let's see if we can get rid of this and still have our float. Yep, no problem. Honestly, that's the easiest way to go. We still have enough room in front. We could give them a little more space, right? And let's see if we can get rid of this sidewalk as well, right? So that's the simplest solution. It feels really tight. Like I'd love to have a bit more space. No, that's close. There we go. Because I wanted to have that completed shadow at the bottom there. It was kind of bothering me that it was cut off. Like shadows and reflections, you either want to have the whole thing or cut it more in half, right? I kind of wish this thing wasn't here, but you know, that is what it is. The other thing that bothers me marginally is these things in the top corner, right? So look at the edges of your images again. In this case, it doesn't bother me so much because you know it's a continuation of this tree, like your brain fills that in, and it almost frames the image and keeps you in, right? Because your eye goes to warm colors before it goes to cool colors. So the dragon being red and orange and pink jumps out, right? And it's also really great lighting because the dragon is being lit from the side. So he's got a ton of texture, okay? Now, I'm going to show you the difference between just adding texture and clarity to the whole image, okay? So you can see what that does, right? Now, there's a lot of good things that are happening in the dragon, but we've just gone to extreme, right? But even still, we don't want that happening on the background. Well, now we have an easy fix because we have a select subject mask. So fingers crossed that it selects the whole dragon and the whole float. Yay! Okay, so it did a good job. Now it looks like it maybe didn't get his little antennas up here or antennae, right? I'm going to make a green mask instead so we can see him. Well, maybe it did. Yeah, maybe it did. I'm just going to do a minus exposure. Yeah, see, now you can see what it's missed, right? So when I turn down -4, you can see that it's missed his little antenna and the back wing here. So we could add to that and try and pick them up. But I don't think it's that big a deal because I just want to add some texture, right? And a bit of clarity, like so. I can also bring those highlights down a bit more if I want. And brighten up the whole dragon even more, okay? Maybe even lift the shadows a bit. So now, right, look at the dragon. If I turn this mask off, right, so we're picking up some of the light on the dragon, brightening him up a little bit, and adding a bunch of texture without doing the rest the same to the back of the image, okay? Now I'm going to show you another neat trick. Again, I've learned lots from Pete today. Is I'm going to, well, first I'm going to name this one. So this is the dragon. Okay. Then I'm going to duplicate this one. And I'm going to invert it. Okay, so now I've got the background selected. I'm going to reset the settings. So double click the word effect, does that. And I'm going to do the opposite. So I'm going to do minus texture, minus clarity, okay? And I might even do a little minus saturation, okay? So the blue, intense blue sky is not quite so intense, right? I might even bring the contrast down and the shadows up a tiny, tiny bit. Okay, so if we want to see what that's doing, okay, Now that's turning both of them off. Let me just turn the drag and copy off. Okay, so see how that's affecting the background? And it's also affecting this foreground. Okay, so if I look at where the mask is on here, right, it goes all the way to the bottom grass as well. Now I don't want to blur the grass because the grass would be sharp along with the dragon, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just subtract, do a linear gradient, right? So I'm going to let the focus sort of fall off. And I did it backwards, so I'll just rotate it. No, I still did it backwards. There we go. Did it right the first time. So now it's not applying on the grass. It's only applying to the top part of the image, right? In the background, like so. And if I want to pick up this wing over here, I could try and do that as well. But for the most part, I think this looks pretty good. Right? So now you can see how I'm blurring. I'll go to extreme for you. So it's kind of a way to blur the background, but if you go too far, you start to get stuff like it looks kind of a little fake, right? So I'm going to keep it somewhere in this middle range here. Again, go to extremes to see it, see what it's doing, and then scale it back, right? Now, what if I wanted to get rid of this whole operation here, right? I would probably take that into Photoshop to do that. Lightroom or Luminar actually has a pretty good erase tool as well. And it would do probably a pretty good job, at least removing the top part, right? But for something like this to try and clone it out in Lightroom, definitely it's not going to do as good of a job. Let's see. Susan says, when you use the mask on the background, does it make the subject stand out too much, almost like a 3D effect? If you go too far, and that's what I mean by if you blur the background so it doesn't look realistic anymore, and that's why I removed the blur from the foreground, okay? Because if I had blurred the grass that the dragon is sitting on, then it's going to look fake. Because if the dragon's sharp, the grass that it's on would also be sharp. So you want to try and keep in mind realism when you're trying to do your editing as well, right? I mean, I could take it a little farther, and I'm not a super fan myself of things like, oops, we'll just call it background. I'm not a super fan of doing things like selective color, okay? Because if I do that, obviously that looks fake, and we'd have to fix the issue with the wing here. But just bringing it down a tiny bit takes the attention off. See how the sky is super vibrant, right? And now it's just taking our attention away from that sky. That's all. Okay? So you kind of do want a 3D effect, and that's what, you know, shooting with a large aperture will do and give you that bokeh in the background, right? But you don't want to go too far so that it looks fake. If that makes sense. Okay, Joan also sent this image, and I just wanted to touch on this one. I'm not going to edit it because I think what she's wanting here is the couple dancing. I'm looking like maybe a groom and his mom are not in focus. I don't know if you can see that, but they're not in focus. The people in the background are. This is not something that you can fix in Lightroom. You could possibly pull this into Topaz Sharpen and sharpen just these guys. But again, that's not something you can do in Lightroom, and you need to have Topaz Sharpen. If you could please drop a link into the review on Topaz Sharpen into the chat, please, Rob. I'm not going to demonstrate that one because that one takes a lot of sort of editing power. All right, let's see what we got here. Okay, so now we have the other Linda Harris. She's using Luminar, so I'm going to do this one in Luminar. Okay, so before I go to Luminar, the only thing I want to look at here is, do I want to crop this image? I can crop it in Luminar as well, but I want to see if there's anything here that I want to crop first, right? So how does everybody feel about this one? Does it look straight? Does it look crooked? The one thing that does bother me, again, I'm looking at the edges of images, right? So always look at your edges. What do I see? it looks like a red Jeep or some kind of a, I don't know, vehicle or something on the edge of the image. So it's catching my attention because of these highlights and the contrast and also the red. Right. So I'm either going to crop that guy out, which again is probably going to be the simplest solution, or I could probably even clone it out in Lightroom, but we'll try the erase tool in Luminar. Okay. Composition is interesting because you've got this wheat or grass in the foreground. We've got, F8, so it looks like there's lots of the image that's sharp, got lots of depth of field, got a bird, we got the flag. So let's take this into Luminar. There's nothing clipping, so that's good. So I'm just going to go straight from here into Luminar. Okay. Now I'm taking a Tiffin, so it just for speed of processing. If you're doing your image directly, Linda, you'll be working on your raw file. Okay. So it's going to open up and you're going to end up with your raw file inside of Luminar. Hopefully on the same screen when it opens. Another question for the group. I'm curious how many people are using Luminar at all. And if you have any questions about the newly announced Neo, okay? Because I'm going to be doing a video with some more information about that this week. I'm just waiting to get my hands on a trial version, okay, for testers. Okay, so the workflow inside Luminar is a little bit different. And if you're used to Lightroom, it comes with what's called templates, and it gives you actually suggestions of some that you could try, right? And it's giving me a suggestion of filmatic and landscape. Okay, so it knows that this image has got a landscape. So I can try these just by clicking on them, right? And right out of the gate, this first one, long exposure, does like, wow, I'm like really impressed with that. You can actually go to the bottom here and just minimize the overall effect of the entire template just by sliding it down a bit, right? So I could say, okay, I like this template, but I don't want it so strong. So it will dial everything down equally, right? Or I can go through and find all the things that it's applied and edit them, okay? So I'm just going to keep clicking on these and see if there's anything else that grabs me. Okay, so that one's kind of cool. It's almost like a faded image. I'm guessing it's got the dramatic filter, so I could play with that one, right? So that's enhancing the sky. I was thinking about doing a sky replacement, but this one's got me rethinking, right? So let's actually work with this. Let's maybe dial it down a little bit because I want a little bit more color. Let's see if it's catching up to me. Okay, so I can, let's go full. I like what it's doing in terms of sharpness. And once you go to edit, you'll see all of the tools over on the right, okay? And anything that the template or preset has applied has a little dot next to it like this, okay? So I was guessing that it applied dramatic, but I was obviously wrong. Okay, so it's applied enhance and sky enhancer. If you want to see each tool, you can just toggle it off and then it will show you what that tool is doing. And you can also edit any of the adjustments. Okay, so in this one, let's go farther with the sky. I find that the sky enhancer, if the sky's got some blue, it often goes too far. And then I would go to the color tool to dial that saturation back again, right? But look what it's doing here. It's making a really nice punch on everything with this accent AI. So sometimes you can get away with just these two things and it makes a really, really cool adjustment to your image, right? Let's see what else it's applied. So it's applied structure, right? We talked about structure, and it's giving that sort of, crunchy clarity overall sort of look. I could choose to mask it on some of the image if I wanted. Actually, let's do that. I'm going to do a graduated mask, and I'm going to remove it from the bottom of the image, okay? And I'll show you why. Because the edge of the image is super sharp. Okay, I'm going to make the fade really long, okay? And I'm going to make the structure really strong so you can see what it's doing. And I've got my mask backwards again. So I'm just going to invert it. Okay, so where you see the red is where it's going to apply. So I should have pulled it from the top down. Okay, so now you can see that this structure, okay, is applying to the top half of the image and it's fading out as it gets to the edge, right? So the difference is, if I go in here to the history, I'll show you this. Okay, so you can see the structure is over the entire image, right? All the way to the edge. And that's what happens when I mask it, okay? So it's not as contrasty on the edge, which is, again, keeping your eye more into the top part of the image, right? There is a vignette applied on this one, right? Now, remember how I said you can position the vignette in the Luminar off center? So that's exactly what I'm going to do. So I'm going to use my same trick, feather to 0, amount dark. Now I get to adjust the size. And let's make it a little rounder because I'm going to fit it right around that barn. And then I get to choose subject. So wherever I click on the image, it's going to move it around, okay? Like so. I'm going to go even smaller. And until I click this choose subject, now it's applied the location. I can just put my feather back up and adjust my amount, okay? So now I can really target the edges except for that house, right? I can even add inner light, which means it's brightening the middle part, which is where the barn is, right? So I can do both at the same time. So that's done a really cool job. So look at the before and the after. Now I've not done any brush work, right? Having a look at this again, I'll often apply one thing and then go back and say, well, I think maybe I do want to mask it, okay? So I'm going to mask the structure a little bit more, and this time I'm just going to use the paint tool and erase, and I'm going to erase 50% from this back field, okay? So I'm just going to make my brush a little bit larger, and you can see that as I'm painting, it's removing the red mask. So I don't want the field to grab quite as much attention as I do the barn itself, right? Even this foreground weeds, let's just take them a little bit less as well, or whatever that is. All right, so now we can see what the structure is doing. It's really grabbing your attention into that center of the image, right? Let's deal with our little truck here. So erase tool and Luminar actually works really, really well. I've tried it on some really complex edits. I removed a pole and something in an image that I was retouching recently for some ladies. So I'm just going to turn that off. So I'm going to paint over the little truck. Actually, I'm going to do a better job of it. I don't want to get that log. So let's try that. And then it's going to think. Okay, so this is an AI tool, right? So it's thinking in the background, structure AI, anything that has these little AI icons is artificial intelligence, and it's working its way hard in the background. Okay, now I did a pretty good job. The only challenge is that it's kind of duplicating. Okay, so that's a danger of, you want to beware of doing that because it looks like it's been edited. So I'm just going to do another pass, and I'm going to try and remove this entire fence post as well. Let's see how it does. But right off the bat, it actually did a really good job. And I've done, like I said, a few tests comparing this tool to replace or content aware fill in Photoshop, which is, pretty amazing. And it actually did as good, if not a better job in some cases, right? So look at that. It did pretty darn good, right? Now, if I want to fix this, I could go into the clone tool, or I could do some other things, but I'm not going to worry about it that much. It looks pretty good, right? Oops. So we got rid of the little red truck. This one is not too bad. I think it looks okay. Now we could add some sun rays, but we could also add something into the sky. We can add some birds. We can add a cloud. We got several clouds already. If you're going to replace a sky or add something to the sky, make sure that it fits for that image, right? You have to have the light going in the right direction, right? So here we've got birds, which are in the background. Now notice how it was actually smart because there's more birds than that, right? Notice how the birds were behind the barn and they didn't show up, right? So it's pretty impressive, I think. I could make them smaller. I can defocus them a little bit so they look like they're in the background. And I can also fade them out and look like they match better with the sky. Okay, so things like adding a little white cloud, things like this, just kind of add on like another little element if you feel like your image needs something to balance it out, right? I'm pretty happy with that. Okay, so you could see that color harmony has been applied, and I think that's what's affecting some of the colors. You can see that it's lowering the yellows and the greens a little bit. Let me see if I can turn that off. Yeah, so it's lowering the brilliance of the color. So if I want more color, I can just bring that back here. Okay. And I'm pretty sure that it's done some adjustments under here, under the color tool. And I'm guessing, yeah, so it's made some adjustments to the hue of cyan. And it's done a bunch of saturation. Okay, so look at all the saturation sliders are roughly at minus 30 or 40, and the red one is at 0. Okay, so it's kept the red. Now, if I want a little more green, I could have a little more green. Okay? If I want a little more yellow, I can have a little more yellow. The sky's been, the blue's been turned way down. So if we want more of the color back, it's easy enough to just bring the color back, right? Like so. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty happy with that. And I'm just going to hit apply. So when I hit apply, it's going to take it back into Lightroom. And I'm just going to hit composition actually before I do that. This is Luminar that I'm working in right now. And I'm going to hit composition AI because what it does is it gives me a suggestion for how to crop the image. And I find that a lot of times the amount of crop is great, but not necessarily the positioning. Okay, I'm not so sure. I'm not convinced yet. In this case, I'm going to leave it the way it is, and I'm not going to crop it here in Luminar. I'm going to take it back to Lightroom, and then I can decide if I want to crop it there. Okay. Now keep in mind the original template that I applied. You can see it now says edited. Okay. So if I really like this, I can just save it, and then it shows up, and I can use it on other images. Right. So under my templates, it will show up under here where it says my templates. I can also still dial it down. So even after everything is said and done, all the stuff that I've applied, look, I can dial the whole thing up or down. Okay. Looks like we got ghosts in the doorway. Look at that. They weren't there before. I like the strength. So we're going to hit apply. Oops. I'm doing tricks on myself because I'm actually looking at what you guys are seeing. All right. So it looks like a few people, Susan is using Luminar, Linda's ordered Neo, Linton says not sure yet. So watch for my email in the next week or so, Linton. I'm going to be showing a few of the early things that were that are not under embargo yet, because there's a lot of stuff that as a Skylum ambassador I've seen that I can't talk about yet. So I'm hoping to get a test build this week so I can show you some things. Yeah, Linda's ordered Neo. Yeah, perfect. Okay, so it looks like a few of you have ordered Neo and also using Lightroom. And like you just saw me do, I use it for both. Okay, but for me to create this same thing in Lightroom, here's my piece on Luminar, and I'll say this for everybody who's using Luminar. Okay, most of the time you can do just about the same thing in any editing software. So it comes down to how fast you can do it, how easily you can do it, and is it fun? Right. The masking stuff that we're doing in Lightroom is a far more complicated process, especially now with all these parameters and intersect and add and all of these things. So there's a bit more of a learning curve. Photoshop's learning curve is obviously straight up if you've ever tried Photoshop. Luminar is more user friendly, and maybe for those of you that are using Luminar, tell the ones that aren't using Luminar, how easy you find it and how easy you found it to just open and start using it. Okay. Like, did you have to sit in front of the computer for hours and hours? Rob, if you could please share a link to our 5-day photo editing challenge for anybody that's not currently using Luminar AI. We have a 5-day challenge where you can actually sign up and you'll get my images, my raw images to practice with. You get a tutorial video every one of the 5 days, and you can just save them and do them on your own time. But there's also a link for a trial version, which is only good for 7 days. So you can actually work through the images and the tutorials in Luminar AI and get a feeling for whether or not you like it. And how Luminar Neo is going to work is very similar. Okay. So if you're new to Luminar, I would suggest that you order Neo, and Rob can put a link to just put our regular Luminar link, Rob, so digitalphotomentor.com/Luminar, and you can get either version right now. Okay, so if you are not using any type of Luminar right now, I would suggest just go straight to Neo. Okay, if you're using AI, I would probably highly suggest that you upgrade, and if you want to use it as a plugin, I would also suggest Neo if you don't already have it. So let's take a look at this image. Let's do them side by side. Okay, so there's the original compared to the Luminar edit, right? Pretty dramatic. It looks like there's absolutely no sky there to work with, but we had lots of sky, right? And also, really great image, Linda. I love it. I think it's fantastic. Notice that I didn't do any cropping, right? If I did want to crop it, the only thing that I might do with this one, let's just do this, is just come up a little bit from the bottom. There's a lot of foreground. There's half the image of foreground, right? And I feel like I want to get to the barn a little bit quicker. And like, feel like the barn is facing this way, so I want more space in front of it. But other than that, I think it's a fantastic image. Absolutely. Lots of texture, great lighting. Love it. Okay, whose have I not done? I've got one came in from Sharon the other day. So I think I haven't done this one. Okay. Oops. Okay, so we got a Sony image, and okay, so this one is a JPEG. Now the challenge is we've done all the editing up to this point using raw files. Okay, if I'm going to edit this one, you're going to start to see the limitations of what's possible with a JPEG, right? Okay, let's take a look. So first of all, we don't have camera profiles, right? So that's an option. As its option is not available because it's a JPEG. Okay, so that's limited. We also don't have the white balance presets. Okay, so when you Rob, can you please share the article on why to shoot raw? So for those of you that are not shooting raw yet, if that's some where you're at, consider switching your camera to shoot both raw and JPEG, because when you get into things like editing, the raw files carry a lot more data, especially in the areas of white balance and exposure. Okay, so as you can see here, if the white balance was really all out to lunch and this image was yellow or blue or something, I wouldn't be able to just choose one of the other presets, right? So I could try auto, right? Another thing you can do when you have an image like this, if you want to color correct it, is use the eyedropper and find something that's neutral. Now, I don't know if there's anything white in this image, because whatever I click on, it's going to make completely neutral. So I'm going to try this dark shadow. Yeah, it's about the same. Okay, so I'm going to warm the image up a little bit and just take out a little magenta. But my big concern is, do we have any clipping? Okay, so when I click on the highlights, you can see that the back of this sea lion, the highlights there are clipping, and I can actually pull that down reasonably well. Right. In this case, I'm going to use the exposure slider because I want to brighten the midtones a little bit, and I want to brighten the shadows. Okay, now look what happens is we've got all these bright highlights on the rocks again. Okay, so I'm going to bring the highlights down. we can try the HSL luminance and see what happens when I do the rocks. But my guess is it's going to affect the sea lions as well. Yeah, it did. Okay, so I can go a little far, but if I go too far, the sea lions are getting affected, and I don't want to do that. Okay. So we're going to be back to mask, select subject, and see how well it does. Okay, so it looks like it did pretty well, except it missed his flipper here. Okay, but I'm going to invert this one because I want to darken the background. Okay, and I'm going to subtract. Now this is where I have to think about it. All right, so I want to subtract luminance range and its flipper. Nope, that was the opposite of what I wanted to do. Let's do that again. We're going to add luminance range. Nope. Sorry, I've got a tickle in my throat today. I'm just going to do good old mask with a brush. Let's see if I can get his flipper. Aha, see? Is the wrong way. I need to subtract. Because I've inverted it, I need to subtract. So everything is backwards. There we go. There, subtract the flipper, and I think he's got a little bit of this flipper. And let's just make sure we got his head and his nose. There we go. I would zoom in to probably 100. Oops. Okay, so this image is small as well, right? So I would definitely zoom in a lot more when I'm doing this kind of masking so that I can see the edge better, right? Yeah, so the challenge here is that I've just got a small image to work with. So, okay, that's pretty good. So now that I've got the mask set on the background, now I can darken. Sorry guys, tickle in my throat. So I can darken. I can also add an edge vignette. Excuse me. And that's in my Lightroom presets. Rob, if you could share a link. No, I don't smoke. Seasonal allergies, let's just call it. If you could share a link to our fall sale, please, Rob. We've actually got all of our digital products and courses on sale right now, including a set of my Lightroom presets that I have available. Okay, so that's allowing me to put more of the attention on those sea lions. Okay, so remember the trick that we did before with the upside down image. I'm going to do that again, and then look what happens when I do the before. Right, so your eye goes to the bright areas, which is everything but the sea lions. Right, now your eye goes a bit more to them, and it's a bit more unified in terms of density. Okay. The other thing that bothers me here is these people in the background. So we can try and use the Lightroom clone and stamp again, similar to what I did with the trees. Like I can have the opacity lower, right, just to darken them, or I can try and get rid of them completely. No, it's actually doing a pretty good job, right? It's because it's chosen this plant over here. So it's basically duplicating the fence, and I just want to make sure I sort of get the lines lined up. And that actually looks pretty reasonable. Let's see if we can get rid of this thing as well, and maybe just tone it down. And I might as well keep going. I'm on a roll here. Let's do this little stick. And again, I'm going to line it up with the fence. Okay, so cloning those little things out in the background. Like I said, the Lightroom clone and heal tool is limited, but you can do things like this, especially when they're blurry in the background and it's not super critical, right? And that tool has not changed. It's underneath here for clone and heal. It's under the Band-Aid, okay? And I'm using healing. Now that I've got this guy here, I'm going to go back and check the whites. And if the sort of these highlights, these are called specular highlights, like reflections of light sources and things. If the specular highlights are clipping a little bit, I think that's fine. I could also come back here and find the subject again and lighten them a little bit. Make sure the highlights stay down and maybe give them a little bit of texture and attract attention. Okay, so again, all the editing that I'm doing is to bring the eye to the subject. Okay. I hope that helps. So let's see where we're at. I might as well give you a full 2 hours today. We didn't take a little break, but let's push through. And I want to do this one of Linda's because I want to show a sky replacement. And I'll just talk about some of these others real quickly. So again, this one of Donald's, I would probably do something really cool in terms of like you've got some really neat geometric patterns and shapes here. So I would probably do something to play it up. If I want to do, I'll just do like a 2-minute edit on some of these here. Right. So I'd probably punch up the shadows and the highlights a little bit, brighten up the whole thing. Now, when you do things like lift the shadows and darken the highlights, you want to make sure that you add blacks back in, right? Because when you have no blacks, your colors disappear and your contrast disappears, right? So watch what happens. So see how that image is just sort of flat looking, but as soon as I add black back in, right? See that? See how it just adds that punch, right? And see how the colors become more enhanced. And I almost never touch saturation and vibrance sliders, almost never. Okay? So I would do something like that. I might crop this one out at the top because, again, it's sort of on the edge. I want to make sure everything is straight as well. So I might get rid of that one at the top. So I might come down to there. This edge looks good. Right, so almost more of a square. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why, but I feel like I want to flip this image. I feel like it just wants to be this way, right? Let's just see the difference here. Because your eye, again, reads left to right, now that I've flipped it both ways, I do feel like this is leading more into the image versus the other way, so I would keep it this way. But I would probably stay in the area of sort of abstract and play around with things like blur and contrast in terms of this one with the shapes. Right? Go with the patterns. This one here, Linda, the bigger issue here and the difference between this one and this one is the lighting, right? This one you could work on and we could, do all the tricks, the double clicks and adjustments and things. And, look at the difference just by increasing the contrast, but by increasing it using the whites and the blacks instead of the contrast slider, look at the difference from there to there. Okay, I haven't touched exposure. Well, I did actually a little bit. I darkened it, right? But I haven't touched saturation or vibrance, right? We can add some texture and clarity, and we can bring the blues down, but I would probably darken this road as well, right? Because the road grabs my attention, so I'm going to do that. And I'm probably going to desaturate it also a little bit like that, okay? Because again, the warm color takes your attention, okay? Now that it's almost gray, your attention doesn't go to the road as much, okay? Like so. I could even shift the hue even a little bit. That's better. A little bit of red, right? So now it sort of blends in a little bit. But the biggest issue here is that the light is midday and it's overhead. So as much editing as you do here, it's not going to be ever as interesting as the previous one with the barn, okay? Because you've got sort of looks like late evening here. You've got light coming on this side. You've got beautiful shape on the barn because one side is lit and the other side is not. And that's what you want in an architectural or an image like this. You want light coming from the side, right? And this one, the light is coming from overhead, right? So if this is a place that's near you, go back and shoot the same road again just before sunset when the shadows are long and sweeping across the landscape, right? Rob, if you could show there's time of day matters article, that would be great. And also light, quality of light, both of those, please. Let me see. I can come back on here. All right. And let's see. Okay, the one that I wanted to finish with, and I didn't talk about Clark's. Same kind of idea as I did on the other ones, Clark. Same idea. I always do the camera profile, right? Landscape. Let's see which ones work best. Standard looks pretty good actually on this one. Okay, so I'm going to go with standard. Shift double click, shift double click. Again, I'm doing this really fast because this is literally how fast I edit. Okay, so I did a correction on the tilt of the horizon. And this one, you need to decide because your horizon is dead smack in the middle. I'm going to reset that. Because your horizon is right in the middle, right? That looks better. You need to decide if the bottom half of the image, the foreground, is more important than the sky, because they're equal. Okay, so it's called visual mass. They're equally weighted, and your viewer does not know where to look, okay, because they're equal. So let's make a decision one way or the other. So we might turn this into a panoramic like that. Okay, so if we go that way, now the land is more important. We still have interesting clouds. Still feels crooked to me. Can't figure out which is where's straight. Does that look straight to you? Right? So that looks more like the land. Okay. So then I would just work on some edits to bring some detail, texture, and clarity, right? Like so. We can do the same thing with the HSL. Again, luminance is going to be blue. There we go. And if I want to bring the rocks out, use my targeted tool, and let's increase the brightness of the rocks. Okay, so that's orange and red. And maybe I want to shift the color of the rocks to be either more red or a little more orange. Let's do a little more orange. Okay. So now the picture is more about the landscape. Okay. If we crop it the other way, right now it's more about the ocean and the sky. So when you're positioning your horizon, you need to make a decision as to what it is you want us to look at and try and do that composition in camera. Okay? I think I prefer that one. All right. Okay, so this last one, now this is Linda's. Was she working in? She's working in the Lightroom. Okay, so Linda Springer. But I want to bring this one into Luminar because of the sky. So let's see. Okay, we're going to change to landscape profile on the camera because look what that does to the fall colors, right? This is a really fun one to be able to play with the HSL sliders and the colors, because what we can do is I can really shift these and shift the reds into more red or shift them into more orange, right? Let's do, I can shift the greens, make everything look more fall colors, right? Like this, like so. Okay? I actually like that red standing out. That's kind of cool, right? So now it looks more fall colory. We can decide we want the yellow trees to stand out more. If you're doing grass, you'll also notice that grass has usually equal or more yellow as it does green. Right? So look at the difference in the contrast in the trees and the color of the trees just by using these HSL sliders. Right? So I've shifted them into looking more like fall. Okay? So that's really cool. We're going to check our highlights. Yeah, we got a little bit of clipping, but we're not going to worry about the sky so much because we're going to get rid of it. Right? There is a sky there, and if we bring the highlights down, we can see it. So we could enhance it, but we could also replace it in Luminar. Right? So let's see both. Okay? So I'm going to make a duplicate of this one, and we're going to do select sky in Lightroom. Did a good job. And I'm going to bring the highlights down. I'm going to bring dehaze up. So that's actually not too bad, but it looks pretty magenta. So I'm going to make it a little bit warmer. And we could actually even add a color to it. Okay, so if you use this color picker down here at the bottom, you see where it says color. If it's set to 0, you'll see an X on it. So if you just click on the X and move the eyedropper around, you can literally pick any color and add it into the sky. Okay, so we could actually give it a little magenta or blue. Okay, we'll see what that's doing. Is really enhancing our sky. Okay, let's see. Now, if I want to increase the landscape, we could try and see what it does with select subject. Let's see what it selects. Aha, it doesn't know. Okay, so then we could duplicate this one. So we've got the sky. I'm going to rename this so I know what they are. So sky. And then this one we're going to invert. So that one's going to be land, or trees actually. And now we've got that selected. We don't want to do the same settings. So double click effect to reset them. Right. I'm going to do a bit more clarity. And I'm actually going to increase the whites. So watch what happens. Just like I did the double click on the whites, now I'm just doing it on the bottom part of the image, right? And it's giving me a lot more contrast in those trees, right? Lift the shadows a bit. Look at that color come out, right? I'm even going to warm it up a little bit. Now, it is affecting the entire water as well. So I'm going to do an intersect to remove. Actually, I'll do a subtract luminance range to remove the light tones in the water. Right now we've got mostly the landscape. And let's see, I can increase this a little bit. There we go. Let's do that. So now we've got the landscape being affected and not the water. And we've lost some of it. Okay, so I'm going to move it over a little bit more. There's a tricky balance. You want to make sure. So this is the spot here where it's sort of the zone that it's using. The further I go away from white, you notice that it's affecting the trees and the water. Okay, so let's just find a balance. Okay, so now if I go further from the right, it's not getting the water like that. There we go. Something in that range. Okay. So before, oops, that was the wrong image. That's the before. And that's where we're at now. Okay. I could darken the water as well, usually with the luminance one. So new mask, luminance range. Oops, I grabbed the rock. That's why I messed up. So luminance range. Let's try that. Okay, so it's picking up a lot of the trees and everything else. And I'm just going to do intersect in this case. So intersect means stuff that's already selected and within that selection. So I'm just going to do a radial filter that goes over the water like this. Okay. So now you can see it's only selecting that tones that I selected first and inside the circle. Okay, so any tones like that inside the circle. So just bring that down. And let's give it some clarity. Right. So that's one edit, right? If we want to do the sky replacement instead, we have to hop over to Luminar. So I'm going to do the same thing. You can also do this in Photoshop. Photoshop has a sky replacement tool now as well. I find I've compared the two, and Luminar's is still way easier to use. Photoshop's, of course, has more flexibility because it puts the mask on layers and things that you can work with separately. So there's an advantage of doing that. But again, with each level of complexity is also a bigger learning curve. Okay, Luminar's over here again. So now I know we're going to go straight to sky replacement, but I want to see what some of these other ones do. Okay, so look at the enhanced AI, right? All of the stuff that I was doing before, right, with all the masking and all that kind of stuff. Look, one slider, right? Super easy, right? I could do the same with the sky and say, okay, let's call it a day. But we're going to leave the sky and we're going to replace it just to see how it's done, right? Rob, if you could share a link to our Sky Pack, which is also currently on sale. So if you don't have your own sky images, you can purchase some. We have a set available right now, actually for $14.50. So there's how many skies? 25 sky packs. When you're picking a sky, you want to make sure that the sky matches what you're putting it into, right? So I'm going to try one sky and we'll see how it looks. And if one of mine doesn't look like it's quite right, you can also see that it's got some masking issues, which we'll deal with. Let me try a different one. Let me try this one. Okay, now that's not bad, right? So it looks like the sun has sort of set behind the horizon. Let's play with that, okay? So it needs a little bit of refinement and it needs possibly some orientation. Okay, so it gives you this horizon position slider, and you can see that it's put the horizon there. I'm actually going to lower it just a little bit and fade it out. So what that means is that that's that area of, okay, I'm just putting the sky, if the lines are closer together, right, it's a sharp edge like that versus, oops, I need the fade. What did I do? Huh. Let's do undo. There we go. I faded when I shouldn't have faded. There we go. All right, so now let's go back to my horizon position. And I can position it down below the hill. And I'm just giving it a bit more of a fade. You can actually even tilt your horizon, right? So if your sky is crooked, you can tilt it. And you can also flip it the other direction. So you can decide which way it works best. And I recommend choosing the flip based on the matching the lighting in the scene. Okay. So the next thing I want to do is just check on how good did it mask. Okay. So look at it, did really good job around the trees. I don't see any halos, right? So the settings that it chose looks pretty good to me. If we need to adjust it, you can do, I find fixed details actually works pretty well. Let's just see. So it's darkened the top of the mountain a little bit, right? Let's just try this one, and I'm going to dial that back a little bit, okay? The other cool thing that it has is what's called scenery lighting. So now you'll notice that the sky is very sort of pink, but the landscape isn't, right? So if we increase this, it's going to match the landscape color more to the sky, as if the sky is reflecting on the landscape. If there's a human, it will add the same type of lighting to the human. Right. Warmth, I'm going to warm it up a little bit so it's not so pink. So this is only applying to the sky. Okay, so now you can see it's going to be a bit more orange than blue. If I go the other way, you can see what that's doing. Atmospheric haze is one that I actually use a lot because it makes the sky sort of not as contrasty. It just sort of softens it a little bit. And you can also defocus the sky. So if your background is out of focus, make sure that your sky is as well. And it's done a reflection. Okay? So you can see that it's actually added the same type of color down here in the water, I think. And we're going to blur the water just a little bit. So let's take a look at the before and after, right? Does that look realistic? I think so. So let's go back to the Sky Enhance filter, which is at the top. Now anything I do to the Sky Enhance applies to the new sky. And anything I do in color, so if I want to shift the blue hues, right, I can do that. So I can shift that. I can shift the red to more orange. So we're still adjusting the sky color. And I can darken the blues. So that looks to me a little more realistic and it's softer, right? I'm going to do landscape, which is another cool one. So golden hour applies obviously this really nice golden glow. Okay, so take your sliders to extremes and then decide where you want to be in the middle. And foliage enhancer does a nice job, but it usually makes too much neon green. So what I do is apply it and then shift it to the left. Oops. Like so. All right. So now I think I'm pretty happy with that. Let's dial my sky down a tiny little bit on this relight. And I think we're good to go. All right, let's apply it. So I'm going to come back over here and let's see how everybody's doing. So any questions about that? For those of you that have stuck around for the full 2 hours, I hope you've got some good tips. Any questions about Lightroom, Luminar? We didn't use Photoshop today, but I find that people are using Photoshop less and less, including myself, right? So the only time I go to Photoshop is if I'm doing something like a head swap, or I need to do some major cloning, or I want to merge two images together with different layers and so on. But ask me after Neo comes out, and that may change as well, because a lot of the things that Neo is saying that it's going to do might be covered by what I'm currently doing in Photoshop. So let's compare again. Right, so there's our Lightroom version's on the left and the Luminar version is on the right. Okay, so neither is right or wrong. They're just different. And I can see that I darkened the water quite a bit more in the right one. Again, not right or wrong. And I think that probably occurred when I was playing with the sliders for the sky color. And I could just go mask that off if I wanted to. Okay. So one thing to consider is if you're using Luminar AI as a plugin and you open it from Lightroom, go to Luminar and come back. Okay, the new file is finished. Okay, so I can't go back to Luminar and continue where I left off unless you're using Luminar on your original raw file as a standalone, as some people are. Okay. Thanks, Catherine. So you must be like overflowing with information today because you've gotten now what 5 hours of education today. Let's see. You agreed with more focus on the land than the sky. I think that was for your water image, right, Clark? The one with the red rocks. Yeah. HSL sliders, I use those a lot. And especially on images like this, you know, where I can adjust the different colors of the trees and so on. And you can see what they did in the sky, right? So sometimes I'll do a sky replacement if I find that the sky is boring, even if I pull down the highlights. And sometimes I will just enhance what's there. Thanks, Linda. I'm glad you enjoyed that. Both Lindas, and you both got the L. So Linda Harris and Springer. So this is your image here. I hope that gives you some ideas of what you can do with your images. Let's see, where are we at? Oops, I'm supposed to be me. There we go. So thanks to the Charlotte Camera Club. I think I covered just about everybody's images, did a little bit on everything. And this video will be remaining on the YouTube channel. So for anybody in your club that wasn't able to join in, just go to youtube.com /digital photo mentor. I can send you that direct link, Lorraine, as well. Or if you want to pop that into the chat, Rob, then the replay will be there for forever. And you can watch it again. You can even slow the speed down once it's on YouTube. So if I talk too fast, you can slow me down or speed me up if you want to just pick up some tips. So probably in a day or two, it'll also be divided up into chapters. So you can skip to each individual image and just watch the ones that you want. So I want to thank everybody for joining. Rob, you are popping in the chat the link to the YouTube, just to our regular YouTube channel. Sorry. Thanks for joining us and for sticking around for a couple of hours. I appreciate you, and have a good evening, everybody. Take care. Stay safe.